I'll tell you what, one thing good has come out of COVID. This grocery store that I sometimes shop at, they changed the way they do their lines to where everybody kind of funnels into one line, right? And even though they have multiple registers, we kind of go one at a time. And I love that. You know why? Because it's fair, right? Like, how unfair is the grocery store most of the time? You get your cart full of stuff. You have to make a decision, right? As you get to the registers, you got to pick a line. And I know you're like I am. You're scoping things out, right? Looking at the other carts that are in the lines, especially if you're at Market Basket, where it's usually like 3, 4, 5 people deep. Like, which line's going to be the best? I don't know about you. I always pick the wrong line. I always pick the wrong line. There's price checks. There's delays. There's all kinds of things. And so I'm watching other people that have gotten in line 5 minutes after I have that are already making their way out to the parking lot. And so I love the single line because it's fair. How many of you love fairness, right? There's a lot of places in our lives where we kind of bump into fairness and unfairness. And obviously, our experience in a grocery store is kind of on the the not so important side of that, but there are times when we run into like real matters of fairness. Like maybe at work, at some point you've been treated unfairly. At school, feels like the way you're being treated compared to other students has been unfair. And so we don't like being treated unfair. We don't like inequity. But we're especially concerned about those things when they apply to us, right, and how they affect us. And so today we're going to look at just a little piece of what Jesus said, who in this series has made these declarations about what it means to be truly fortunate. And Jesus is, in these topics that we're looking at, over the course of these weeks, he's just turning the world upside down. He's taking like the laws of the world and he's turning them on their heads. And today we run into another one of these principles, which is found in Matthew chapter 5. It says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." So here Jesus makes this proclamation of what it means to live kind of in this fortunate state. And he speaks specifically to, I guess, what we could term the desire that we have for this thing called righteousness. So we're going to spend a little time talking not only about that desire that Jesus is trying to bring to surface, but what exactly is righteousness in the first place. When I read that beatitude, I don't know about you, but I wonder, do we actually do that? When Jesus says, "Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, they shall be satisfied," do we actually do that? Any of us? Notice he didn't say, "Blessed are those who are righteous." Right? Because if he said that, we'd all take breathe a sigh of relief, right? Because I look out there and all I see is a bunch of righteous looking people. But Jesus didn't say, "Blessed are the righteous." Not blessed are those who have the appearance of righteousness, but blessed are those whose longing, whose desire is for righteousness. There's a difference between being seen as righteous and longing for righteousness. If you're familiar at all with the story of Jesus talked about through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these 4 gospel accounts, you'll find Jesus constantly coming up against those who looked very, very righteous. The outward perception of them would leave you with no other conclusion other than that they are righteous people who do good, who figured it out. But there is a difference between being seen as righteous and longing for righteousness. Why? Well, because for one thing, we see the best parts of one another, right? Like I can stand here and I can appear to be righteous, but little do you know, those more unrighteous parts of my being, of my life, of my decisions, of my words, of my thoughts, right? We come in here to church and we demonstrate for everybody else that's here the very best part of us. But we're not talking about appearing to be righteous. We're not even talking about like the effort that goes into trying to be a good, upstanding, moral, ethical, righteous kind of person. Because it's not about appearing to be righteous or even that pursuit of righteousness. What Jesus here seems to be concerned with is the desire in our hearts for righteousness. He says that's where desire comes from. It comes from the heart. We hunger and we thirst for it. When he says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst, he's speaking about those who, with desire, a desire that is greater than other desires, right? They want this thing. Now, we all understand how appetites work and desires work, right? Like you're sitting here right now with any number of desires that you may be experiencing. If you haven't had a drink in a while, maybe you're thirsty. If you didn't have breakfast, maybe, if not now, but in a few moments, your stomach starts grumbling and you start feeling these physical manifestations of hunger, right? We have all kinds of desires in this world. Some good, some bad, right? But like we are loaded with, and we experience over the course of any given day, a pretty exhaustive list of wants, of desires. And Jesus here seems to be saying, blessed are those who, among all the appetites that they're experiencing, have in them rising to the top, rising to the surface, overwhelming all of those other desires and inclinations and wants. They have a hunger and a thirst for righteousness. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm hungry, there's very little else I can even think about. How many of you admit to being hangry every once in a while, right? You experience that one? Like when we're hungry, when we're really, really hungry, there's little other that people can do to provide solace in that moment, right? Like there's no act of kindness that somebody can do, no words that they can say that's going to make us feel less hungry than we do. And so we start to act differently. We start to behave differently. We start to think differently. Why? Because our body is consumed with this desire for food. And until we're filled, until we're satiated, like little else matters. And so that's why we go and eat. And so Jesus seems to be describing like the same degree to which we experience that physical hunger where little else matters. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst, who have this appetite rising to the surface, even above all the other appetites and desires that we experience. One of Jesus' disciples, his name is John. He wrote the Gospel of John, and then he also wrote 3 short letters that are kind of toward the end of your Bible. 1 John, 2 John, 3 John. Also wrote Revelation. So he wrote a lot. And John was described as the disciple whom Jesus loved. When John refers to himself in his own gospel, instead of using his name, he talks about the disciple that Jesus loved. There was a special affection. We know that Jesus had his 12 disciples, and then among those 12, there were 3 that were especially close to him. And then even deeper in that inner circle was this relationship we had with John. And so John understood a great deal about love. John talked about love in a variety of ways. And in one of these letters that he wrote, just generally to the churches at large, he said this in 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 and 17. He said, do not love the world or the things in the world. So John here, he is talking about when he describes this affection of love, is speaking of desire, right? And in essence saying, don't put your affection, don't let your desire be in the world or in the things in the world. Because if anyone loves the world in that way, then the love of the Father is not in him. I don't know about you, but that sounds really, really harsh, right? Like there's an absolutism to that statement that he's making, that if I have a love for the world or the things in the world, then I cannot at the same time have the presence of the Father's love in my life. And then he goes on to describe what he means. He says, all that is in the world, and I highlighted it, the desires, right? Because we're talking about desires, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and the pride of life, like these things, these major categories, these major compartments in which pretty much all of our appetites and desires live, he says, is not from the Father, but is from the world. So do not love the world. Don't put your love and your affection in the world. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, that there is this love for something other than what we find in our everyday life in this world. Jesus says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. For righteousness. What is righteousness? I know when we hear that word, a lot of times we correlate it to like being good. You talk about somebody who's righteous. It's like somebody who like just kind of borders on the brink of perfection. You know, they may not quite be fully there, but they're just like, you know, that's a righteous person. We think about behavior. We think about, again, what we can observe in our experience. Righteousness, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, outside of the context of religion, in just normal, everyday, worldly culture, this word righteousness conveyed the idea of being governed in life by law and order and by a sense of duty. A person who lived righteously in the world of the Greek citizen was a person that could be described as coming under the law and order of the land. A person who lived with this sense of duty, that lived for something beyond just themselves and their own selfish desires. It was a high and lofty virtue that people aspired to. In fact, it was the overarching governing principle for what it meant to be a good citizen. If you read something like Plato's Utopia, how do you create the perfect society? Well, in order to have the perfect society, you have to have a society filled with righteous people. So the words borrowed from that in the realms of ethics and religion, and this concept of righteousness was a very important concept in the life of a Jewish person. In fact, you see, if you read through the Old Testament, right, that first part of our Bibles, the parts that predate the arrival of Jesus, you'll find this subject of righteousness being really at the forefront of much of what is talked about. And righteousness was, again, interestingly, not necessarily or primarily tied to a person's ability or willingness to uphold some particular moral code. It wasn't even primarily referring to the morality of a person, but rather it was used to describe the relationship people had in covenant with God. So much of what we read in the Old Testament tells us the story about this covenant that existed between God and this group of people that he had together made an agreement with, that he would be their God and they would be their people. And then in that covenant, there were obligations from either side that they had toward one another. And to live righteously meant to uphold your part of the covenant. God is always described as righteous, right? Never does God fall short of living up to his end of the bargain, whereas, of course, his people did again and again and again and again. And so they would be described as living in varied states of either righteousness because they were following the requirements that God had imposed on them as his people, like, here's your part of the deal, here's your end of the bargain, here's what you signed up for. right? That would be described as righteousness. Or if they weren't doing those things, if they weren't living their lives in honor to God and in worship of God and God alone, if they weren't caring for their fellow man, if they weren't hospitable to the stranger, if they were committing various acts of oppression or injustice, then they would be described as unrighteous. And so this thought is carried into the stream of thought that Jesus now pronounces when he says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." And so righteousness conveys ideas on a couple of different levels. For one, it conveys the idea that this person has this intense longing, this intense desire to do what is right. You and I, we experience that, hopefully, right? For the most part, I bet, we sit here and we'd say, yes, to a large degree in my life, I have this desire to do what is right. I don't know if I'd call it intense or not. But I'm a pragmatic individual, and I know that usually when I do right, things go right? When I do well, things go better. And so most of us have learned, these principles of living in this world and what it means to get along with one another. So even apart from, any desire to make Jesus happy, we know, this is what I've got to do in life. I can be a really mean, awful, lousy person, but that's going to carry with it the ramifications of being a really mean, lousy, awful person. So most of us, we don't pursue, that kind of living. We may fall into it, right? We may commit acts that could be described as mean and awful and nasty and all that, of course. But that's generally not our pursuit. Our pursuit, for the most part, is, to be good, right? You want to be good. You're here because... among other things, like it's a good thing for you to be here. And when you leave here and you interact with other people, other human beings in this world, hopefully you will act humanly and kindly and graciously toward them. In doing so, we're good. But Jesus here is describing this intense desire from the heart to do what is right. And so the kind of righteousness that he is describing is one that is not brought to the forefront for the reasons that a lot of times our righteousness is brought to the forefront. For instance, a lot of times people, they will live or act righteously out of fear. Maybe it's been your experience within your lifetime of religion or of spiritual growth. Perhaps you've been in a context where it felt like your behaviors, your thoughts, your actions, all of that were largely manipulated by fear, right? You acted righteously, you lived righteously out of fear for what would happen if you didn't. He's not talking about a righteousness that comes out of coercion, right? Very related to fear, or from guilt. How many people have talked about in their religious experience this movement from doing what's bad to doing what's good because of the guilt that's associated with doing what's bad? Again, not that guilt doesn't play, some part in bringing us to where God wants us to be, but guilt should not be the primary motivating factor that moves us from living unrighteously to living righteously. Some people, they aspire to live righteously out of a desire to fulfill the law, right? Some of us are wired, for the most part, to want to be rule followers. Like we find comfort in just following the rules, at least the rules we don't think are stupid, right? Nobody wants to follow stupid rules, but we follow the rules because you're supposed to follow the rules. And again, Jesus isn't talking about the effort that goes into living this life that measures up ultimately to some written standard of law or rules. How many of you'd say, I've acted a certain way because of peer pressure? Sometimes positive peer pressure, right? Like some people, they they do good because they are pressured into doing good by other people who are around them. Again, I'm not saying it's a bad thing necessarily, but that should not be the motivation that brings to the surface this desire to do what is right. Jesus describes it as coming from the heart. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst. Again, just referring back to those hunger pains that we're experiencing where our bodies are craving food. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. But then there's another side to this righteousness as well. This righteousness that moves beyond just my own personal experience and my own personal obligation to God to live in such a way that honors and glorifies Him. Like it's not enough for me to just kind of figure out to the best of my ability how to do that and then go lock myself up somewhere. But righteousness has this other side to it that actually now brings us into our world and into the society in which we live. And it could be said that the righteousness that we should be longing for and desiring in our hearts is an intense desire from the heart that justice be done everywhere. Coupled with the sense or the idea of right living, when we use this word righteousness, along with that is also, and even some of our translations will use the word justice in place of righteousness. There is this intense desire from our heart that not only do I live personally righteous in the fulfilling of, this covenant that I have with Jesus, where He is my master and I am His servant, where He is my Lord and I am His subject, but there's also, beyond my own experience, a desire that justice be done everywhere. You see, it isn't enough that our personal lives be ordered to the degree that they can be in order, that our personal lives be, far enough above reproach that, few people could criticize or judge us for being bad people, right? That's not enough. It's not enough when, while I am doing everything I can to be a good, righteous Christian person, that my neighbor, that the foreigner is experiencing injustice and oppression. The justice and the righteousness that may or may not define my life personally can't be limited to my own personal experience and convey the same degree of desire that Jesus seems to be talking about here when He says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. It's a righteousness, it's a desire that screams out, God, I want to live right before you, right? That's on the one side of the coin. That is this intense desire. God, I know I don't always do right, but Lord, I want more and more to live right before you, to honor you with my life. But then even beyond that, God, I am so unhappy and I am so dissatisfied with the world as I experience it, with the world as I witness it. Lord, I cannot feel the sense of satisfaction and okayness when so many are experiencing injustice and oppression. And God, my heart just yearns and desires and cries out for justice to be done, not only in my life, but everywhere. Now, the question is, where do we find this desire? How do we incubate, if I could say it that way? How do we grow in this desire for justice? Because I don't know about you, but when it comes to desire, that's oftentimes an area of struggle. In fact, I don't even know, to be honest, I don't know what to tell you to do to even make that desire greater and deeper than it may already be, or probably more realistically in the absence of what it ought to be, right? I'll bet most of us are sitting here with a pretty low grade of this deep longing for righteousness than we ought to. So what do we do about that? Like, what do we do if in fact my heart is not yearning? It is not like that appetite for living rightly before God isn't rising to the top. No, in fact, the other appetites of my life instead actually are far more influential in my life and in my choices and in my thoughts and in my words than that appetite for living righteously before God. What if I don't have that yearning, for justice to be done in the world? Like if I were perfectly honest with you, I'm just far too selfish to actually really care all that much about what's going on with maybe not my neighbor, right? Because I got to see them, but with other people that I don't know or have no association with. How do I grow in that desire? Well, I want to propose to you that desire can be found and it can grow only as our lives become more Christ-centered. What a surprise, right? Here we are in church, and now the preacher's going to tell me that my life has to be more centered on Jesus Christ. Who's paying this guy anyway? Right? Like, we all know that. We might know it, but generally we don't live that. Generally, our lives are not actually lived as Christ-centered as they ought to be. I want to share with you, hopefully quickly, a story that comes out of the Gospel of John chapter 6 that I think illustrates and reinforces this idea of where our hunger, is sourced and where it can grow. Many of you probably are familiar with the story of when Jesus fed 5,000 people. I don't care if there were 5,000 people, if there were 5,000 men, and then when you add women and children in there, it was 10,000 or 12,000. It doesn't matter. 5,000's enough. The point of the story is Jesus was there speaking to a crowd of thousands of people and wanted to feed them. They were hungry, right? He was like I am, just preach too long. And he just kept them there, past that point where like their bellies were growling. Right? And so Jesus says, what can we feed them? And of course, they don't have the food or the money to buy that kind of food. And so Jesus is told, we got a little bit of bread and some fish, but that's not enough for us, never mind all these people. And of course, the miracle takes place where everybody in the crowd is fed. And then after everybody's fed and satisfied, right? Jesus said, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. In the same sense, physically speaking, this crowd was satisfied. This hunger that they were experienced was satiated, and they took up 12 baskets full of food even after everybody was fed. So this miracle, this incredible miracle takes place. And so much so that the Bible tells us that the people were ready to make Jesus their king. Like that was all they needed. It's like, Jesus, if you can make food appear for thousands of people. We haven't heard of such a thing for now generations and generations when we hear these stories about how our forefathers were fed in the wilderness by this weird stuff that just fell from heaven that they ate and were nourished by. They were ready to make him king, and so Jesus, he sneaks away, right? It's not time for that yet, basically. His disciples get in a boat, and they go to the other side of the lake, and then Jesus, he goes to the other side of the lake. He walks on water, of course, just gets in the boat with them, makes his way to the lake, and the next day, this crowd, those who remained, we don't know how many, but the remainder of this crowd, they get up and Jesus and his disciples are gone. And so they got into boats. They go to the other side of the lake. They're looking all over for Jesus, right? They were ready to make him king. And so there's a desire, there's some kind of longing there that they have for him. And when they find Jesus, they're excited for whatever it is that he's going to do next. Here's what Jesus says to them. John chapter 6, verse 26. Truly I say to you, You're seeking me, not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. So Jesus speaks to the desire, right? You are in love with me and with this experience where your bellies were filled, and now you're seeking me because you've had your fill. Like you want for that desire to be satisfied again and again, right? Because that's what happens. It's one thing to eat a meal. A period of time goes by and now you're hungry again, right? And Jesus recognized that. So Jesus says, don't work for the food that perishes, right? Don't work for the normal, ordinary, average food that you eat with your mouth, take into your body, but for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you, right? Son of Man being a title for Jesus. And so the people say to Jesus, like, Jesus, what do you want us to do, right? That's always the question. What do you want us to do? What do you want us to do? What do you want us to do? And Jesus says in response to this question, what do you want us to do? He answered them, this is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent. Last thing you want to hear when you're asking the question, what do you want me to do, is what Jesus says here. Believe, like there's nothing to do. There's nothing to do at all. Believe in him, right? Believe in me. Put your trust, put your faith in me is essentially what Jesus tells them. This idea of faith in the Gospel of John is a really, really important theme. In fact, John says, hey, the whole reason I'm writing any of this down is so that you will believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Like that's all I care about. I just want you to, where right now you don't believe he's the Son of God, I want you to read what I have to say so that you will believe that he is the Son of God. And when he uses this construction of belief, like he's talking about something that is beyond just some kind of like, mental affirmation of information, but rather the construction of the word is that you will believe into something. When Jesus says, believe in him, it's put your trust in me. Like, not just believe I'm here. Of course I'm here. But put your trust in me. And then Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Like, listen, again, your life is defined and can be described by any number of appetites and desires at any given time. But I am the bread of life. And whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled, or they shall be satisfied. Where does that desire find its fulfillment? It finds it in the bread of life, in Jesus. And the degree to which we are not satisfied in this life probably speaks to the degree to which we are absent in our desire for and our pursuit of Jesus. And so where is righteousness found? Righteousness is found in Jesus. It's found in Jesus over everything else. When Jesus says they shall be satisfied, it conveys the idea of being saturated, of being filled. The word was used to describe the feeding and the fattening of livestock that would ultimately become food for a family. Righteousness is found in Jesus over everything else. We run to and we look for and we try to read and learn about and we try to find the answers, to what it is that our hearts really, really, really want. It's like Jesus is saying, tell me what you want, what you really, really want. Tell me what you want, what you really, really want. We might think we know the answer to that, right? But what our hearts are craving, what our hearts are longing for, what our heart desires, righteousness found in Jesus over everything else. What do you do for it? Well, you don't do anything for it. That's the beauty of this. Like, you get to come to church today, and you're not going to be told to do anything. What you're invited into is to put your trust, your whole heart, invest that in Jesus and put him at the center of your life. And from there springs a desire for righteousness, a desire to live right, not living right out of compulsion or fear or coercion or peer pressure, but out of this desire to live for him and to please him, to like we would describe, like to make him happy, you know? I've always tried to find approval with my parents. You know, you'll find kids saying, I've always tried to like win my dad's approval. I've always tried to win my mom's approval. And like we don't win Jesus's approval out of our effort, but rather what springs from this desire, this willingness to put our trust and our faith in him is this desire for righteousness, a righteousness that pertains not only to my own life, but then extends beyond. Listen, there's all kinds of people that are very concerned about, you know, various issues in our world, issues regarding oppression and injustice and all that, and that aren't motivated by any relationship for or with or love for Jesus, right? Like that just, and we know that, like I don't need Jesus to hate injustice taking place, you know? I don't need Jesus to, you know, to fall on the right side of, you know, the injustice of human trafficking, for instance. You're going to find people that don't care a lick about Jesus that are going to care about that particular issue. And so there's this desire, you know, this virtue, whether it comes, you know, out of our own just natural selves or out of this experience of finding, you know, a real desire for righteousness in Jesus. And Jesus is constantly pointing us back to him, and him being the object from which that righteousness will spring. That story where Jesus was talking about, or talking to the crowd of people that he had fed. The end of that story kind of goes where Jesus preaches the sermon, essentially, and like people didn't understand it, they didn't like it, and so the narrative goes, and many of his disciples departed from him. We don't hear this about Jesus all the time, but there were these experiences sometimes within the scope of Jesus' ministry where in a moment, the crowds were crazy and nuts and ready to make him king. And then the next moment, they're like, okay, that is just too much for me. And off they go. And so Jesus, as he looks around and sees how the crowd has been whittled down back to, you know, basically his disciples, his 12 disciples, he says to them, do you want to go away as well? Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God. Peter, to the extent that he was able at this particular point in his life, at least had sort of kind of figured out what it meant for Jesus to be at the center. And his question was, Jesus, where else could I go? Like, where am I going to find what it is that you bring? Like, you yourself said, you're the bread of life. And I believe that, and I trust that. And I know, I mean, I can walk away and I can go and try and find what my heart is craving. I can try to find what I am longing for and what I desire. You know, I guess I could go back to fishing, right? But I don't think I'm going to find any satisfaction there. I could go and try a different career, but I don't know that I'm going to find any satisfaction there. There are all kinds of opportunities the world will present to Peter and to me and to you. But Peter said, where else can I go? You're the one that has words of eternal life. And so Peter recognized the centrality of Jesus in that moment and how integral it was for him to actually experience what it means to grow in this hunger and this thirst for righteousness.